And let's see if we can't finish the fourth chapter of The Spell of the Sorcerer's Skull by John Bellairs. Johnny and Fergie really can't figure out what to do about the professor missing. They think that L with the vines around it might stand for Levine, but Johnny ended up in the back of a car with his priest, Father Higgins, who said that he might know something about a ritual and let us pick up there. Johnny was only half listening to what Father Higgins was saying. He was all worked up about this ritual, about the ritual that Father Higgins had mentioned, and he wanted to quiz him about it. Father, he said hesitantly, what about, you mentioned a ritual of some kind? I wondered if maybe... Ah, yes, said the priest, cheering up suddenly. He began to study the bowl of his pipe, as if there were dark secrets hidden there. I did mention something of that sort, didn't I? Well, I know I'm going to sound like a superstitious old Irishman, but I think I would leave a petition under the base of the statue of St. Anthony in our church. You know the statue I mean, don't you? Johnny nodded. He knew it well. It was a large painted plaster figure that stood on a pedestal in front of one of the pillars in St. Michael's Church. Well then, the priest went on in a conspiratorial tone, how about if you and I meet in the church this coming Wednesday night after the service? This was something I was going to try myself, but I kept thinking it was an idiotic notion. However, now that you've put the flea in my ear, I'm a bit more eager to try. I have a few extra things to throw in, just to make the ritual more effective. Not that I think we'll get any results worth writing home about, but, as they say, it can't hurt. Johnny believed in superstitious practices and magic more than the average kid did, and it seemed logical to him to think that maybe the professor could be located and saved by a magical rite. After all, his disappearance had been surrounded by strange supernatural omens and signs. If magic had snatched him away, maybe magic could bring him back. And so, when Wednesday evening came around, Johnny went off to St. Michael's Church. Every Wednesday night during the month of May, special services were held in the church in honor of Mary, the Mother of Christ. Normally, Johnny did not go to these services, so Grandpa and Grandpa Dixon were quite surprised when he told them he was attending. Grandma would have gone with him, but she had a cold, and she was afraid the night air would make it worse. Johnny was immensely relieved that she wasn't going. He felt nervous and embarrassed about what he was doing, and he wanted as few spectators as possible when he and Father Higgins did their mumbo-jumbo. All through the service his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking, will it work? Well, he'd know fairly soon. The service ended, and the people filed out of the church. When Johnny was sure he was alone, he got up and walked to the front of the church and stood before the statue of St. Anthony. It was about 6 feet high, and since it stood on a tall pedestal, it towered over him. The statue showed St. Anthony as a monk in a brown robe. He was holding a book in one hand. The other hand was raised in a blessing. There was a gilt halo behind his head, and on his face was a blank, wide-eyed stare. Before the statue stood an iron rack with flickering candles on it. People had lit them in honor of the saint, so that he would answer their petitions. Johnny fidgeted and glanced around. He felt silly, but he reminded himself that Father Higgins was in on this too. But where was he? Probably he was in the sacristy, which was the room where the priest got dressed for Mass and other services. Maybe he had decided that the whole thing was a bad idea, and had therefore gone home. Johnny hoped that this was not the case. He fidgeted some more. He drummed his fingers on his legs, and walked back and forth, humming softly under his breath. At last he heard the sound of the sacristy door opening and closing. He looked up and saw Father Higgins walking toward him. He was wearing a long white gown called an alb, and around his neck was a kind of embroidered purple scarf called a stole. In one hand he carried a tarnished silver holy water sprinkler. In the other he carried a small pad of paper and a pencil. Johnny was surprised to see that the priest was just as nervous as he was. He kept glancing toward the back of the church to see if anyone was watching. "Here," said Father Higgins gruffly, and he shoved the pad and pencil at Johnny. He turned toward St. Anthony and bowed, and then walked closer to the statue, raised his hands in a gesture of supplication, and rattled off a prayer in Latin. Johnny did not understand much of it, but he heard the words Sanctus Antoninus several times, and he figured the priest was calling on St. Anthony to hear their prayers. Raising the sprinkler, Father Higgins shook drops of holy water over the base of the statue. Some water fell on the burning candles, which hissed loudly. Again the priest bowed, And once more he turned to Johnny. "All right, here's what you do," he said brusquely, tapping the pad with his finger. "Write down your petition, fold the paper over twice, and hand it to me." Johnny raised the pencil and wrote, "Dear St. Anthony, please help us find Professor Childermass. Please hear us and do not fail us. Amen. Yours truly, John Dixon." Johnny tore the sheet from the pad and folded it twice. He handed the note to Father Higgins, who asked him to hold the holy water sprinkler for a minute. While Johnny watched, the priest edged in between the candle rack and the statue's pedestal. Reaching up, he placed a brawny hand on the front of the statue and tilted it slightly back. With his other hand, he stuffed the note in under the base of the statue. Then gently he lowered the statue back down. Johnny heard a soft chink as the statue came to rest on the pedestal again. Grunting a little, Father Higgins squeezed himself out from behind the candle rack, and walked back to where Johnny was standing. He took the sprinkler from Johnny, showered the statue with more water, and then said another Latin prayer. "There," he said wearily, folding his arms and stepping back to watch the play of candle shadows on the statue's pallid face. "I didn't think I could remember all that razzmatazz, but I did. And if you ever tell anyone in this parish we did this, I'll have your hide. I think Bishop Monaghan would go through the roof if he knew I was such a slave to mummery and flummery." Johnny was genuinely grateful for what Father Higgins had done tonight. Whether or not the ritual worked, at least they had tried. However, there were still some lingering questions in his mind. "What do we do now, Father?" he asked. "I mean, how do we know if what we did worked or not?" Father Higgins sighed. "I might have known you'd ask that. Well, we're supposed to wait 3 days and then come back and see what, if anything, is written on the paper. If the saint answers us, he will answer us in that way." Johnny looked at the priest doubtfully. "Has this ever worked before? Did anyone ever—" "No," said the priest, with a mournful shake of his head. "Not that I ever heard of, anyway, but as I told you the other day, there's no harm in—" Suddenly there was a loud sound like a pistol shot. A door at the back of the church blew open, and it banged loudly against the wall. A cold wind blew in, and the candle flames flickered. Johnny jumped. With a wild look on his face, he peered into the darkness, and then he turned and gaped at Father Higgins. The expression on the priest's face was absolutely unreadable, but his eyes were gleaming, and Johnny wondered, was this a sign? Would their prayer really be answered? And that is the end of Chapter 4.